The year 1847 came to Ashenmore on the back of a killing frost. It arrived without ceremony, settling over the stone walls and frozen furrows of the Scottish borders like a judgment. The hills were the colour of old pewter, the sky pressed low, and deep within the grounds of Cairnhollow House, in a stable that smelled of hay and old leather and something wilder, a horse stood alone. His name was Revel. He had come from Ireland 2 years prior, a gift from a cavalry general who could no longer manage him, which was itself a delicate way of saying that 3 experienced horsemen had tried, and 3 experienced horsemen had failed. Revel was 16 hands of black Welsh cross, with a chest like a battering ram, and eyes that held a quality not often seen in horses, a profound, possessing intelligence. He did not panic, he did not bolt, he simply refused. Every hand that reached for him was met with stillness and a look of such serene contempt that grown men found themselves stepping back without quite knowing why. Lord Ashton Grieve had acquired him because he collected difficult things, estates with ruinous debts, political causes without easy victories. And now, apparently, a horse that would not be ridden. He kept Revel in the North Stable. He visited him. He respected him from a distance, and he had quietly given up on the idea of ever putting a saddle on him. The stable hands were told to feed him, clean his stall, and leave him alone. It was one of the stable hands, or so most people assumed, who first changed things. Her name was Wren Calloway, and she was not, in fact, a stable hand. She was the daughter of a man who had once been one of the most respected solicitors in Edinburgh, a man named Arthur Calloway, whose name had been dragged through the legal press some 8 years prior on an accusation of fraud so vicious and so precisely constructed that it could only have been the work of someone who understood the law well enough to weaponize it. This had never been proven. It had never needed to be. The accusation alone had been sufficient to ruin him. He had died 2 years after the trial, not from illness, but from the particular slow grief of a man who watches everything he built dissolve while he is still standing in it. Wren had been 17 when it happened. She was 25 now. She had spent the intervening years doing what women in her position did, surviving. She had taken work where she could find it, ignore. She had learned to shrink herself to fit the spaces that were available. A schoolroom in Glasgow for a year, a companion position in Perth that had ended when the old woman died, and finally, through a connection she no longer remembered clearly, a position at Cairnhollow House as an under-gardener's assistant, which was a generous title for someone who planted onions and swept mud, and she did not complain. She had learned, in the way that people learn things the hard way, that complaint was a luxury available only to those who had somewhere else to go. She had nowhere else to go. So she was quiet, and invisible. And she swept the mud with the same precise attention she had once given to the Latin exercises. Her father had set her at the breakfast table on Saturday mornings. She had not intended to go near the North Stable at all. It was a Tuesday, in early November, and the kitchen garden was glazed with ice, and she had been sent across the yard to return a set of secateurs to the head groundskeeper. The groundskeeper's shed was behind the North Stable. The path ran directly past it, and as she passed, she heard a sound that stopped her, not a distressed sound, not a kick or a crash, just a long, slow exhale, the kind that comes from a creature that has been holding something for a very long time and does not know how to put it down. She stopped. She stood at the stable door and looked in. The horse was at the far end of his stall, not facing her. But she could see the set of his shoulders, the way his weight rested unevenly. He was not injured. He was simply tired, tired in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. She recognized it. It lived in her own chest like a stone. She did not enter. She simply stood in the doorway and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to a horse that did not know her. She breathed. Cold air came off the stone floor in slow waves, and after a moment, the horse turned his head. He looked at her. He did not flatten his ears. He did not shift his weight away. He simply looked, with those dark, measuring eyes, the way a person looks at someone they are not yet sure they can trust. She looked back. After a while, she went on her way. She came back the next morning, and the morning after that, she did not bring anything. She did not try to enter the stall. She stood in the doorway and was quiet, and after the third morning, the horse walked to the far side of his stall and stood closer to her. His head angled slightly in her direction, and she understood that this was something. She began to hum. It was not a deliberate choice, a plea. It was simply what happened when she was not thinking about being careful. A low, shapeless melody that her father had whistled sometimes in the evenings, and a fragment of something Irish she had never known the name of. She could not have reproduced it intentionally. It came from a place that had nothing to do with intention. The horse went still. She did not know. She did not know she was being watched. Ashton Grieve had come to the North Stable for a reason he could not have fully articulated. He sometimes walked the grounds in the early morning when the house was still dark and he could not sleep, which was more often than he admitted to anyone. He heard the low sound of a woman's voice, too quiet to be alarming, too steady to be frightened. He had stopped in the shadow of the doorway opposite. He watched the horse cross the stall toward her. Revel stopped an arm's length from the wooden rail that separated them. He lowered his head. Neater, his whole bearing changed. The vigilance did not leave him, but it rearranged itself into something less defensive, more curious. The way wariness can sometimes, under the right conditions, become a tension. The woman had not moved. She was standing with her hands at her sides, not reaching, not performing stillness, but simply inhabiting it, the way some people inhabit rooms, without claiming them, without apologizing for being in them. Ashton did not announce himself. He turned and walked back to the house, but he stood at the window of his study for a long time afterward, watching the stable yard below, long after there was anything left to see. He made inquiries, quietly. The head groundskeeper told him she was Calloway, one of the garden staff, a good worker kept to herself. He said her father had been a solicitor in Edinburgh. He did not say more. He did not need to. Ashton knew the name, Ivton. He had been a young man when the Calloway case had been in the papers, and he had read it with the particular attention of someone who trusted the law and found it failing in front of him in real time. He had not thought of it in years. He thought of it now. He sent a message to the head groundskeeper that afternoon. Miss Calloway was to be reassigned to the stable staff, effective the following Monday at tea. She was to assist with the care of the North Stable. The groundskeeper relayed the message. Wren received it in the tool shed, where she was cleaning mud from a trowel. She stopped cleaning. She turned the message over in her mind, the way she turned things over, carefully, looking for the weight of it, looking for what it might cost her. The horse was unpredictable, by all accounts dangerous. She was not a stable hand. She knew horses from her childhood. Her father had kept 2. But that was a different life ago, and the distance between that girl and this woman felt, on most days, like an ocean. She thought of the way the horse had lowered his head. She went on Monday. The head groom, a solid man named Pell, with 30 years of horses in his hands, and a healthy skepticism of everything else, looked her over with the expression of a man who has been handed a problem he did not ask for. Decline. He told her to muck out the empty stalls. He told her not to go near Revel without him present. He told her that the last man who had gone near Revel uninvited had spent a week with his arm in a sling, and said it with the tone of someone who found this informative rather than cautionary. She mucked out the stalls. She was thorough about it. At noon, Pell left to take his dinner. She was alone in the stable for 20 minutes. She did not go to Revel's stall. She simply worked near it, staying in his line of sight, moving steadily, not fast, not slow, without the studied carefulness that horses find as alarming as sudden movement. She hummed the fragment of her father's tune. She kept her eyes on her work. After 10 minutes, she heard the soft percussion of hooves on straw, and she did not look up. She felt the change in the air, the warm breath, the enormous quiet proximity of something very large choosing to come close. She looked up. The horse was at the rail, his nose 6 inches from her shoulder, watching her with that same dark intelligence. She went very still. She did not reach for him. She simply held her position and breathed. He exhaled against her arm. It was a slow, considering sound. She reached up, not toward his nose, but to the rail, resting her hand there, differing rather than taking. He dropped his nose to her hand and stayed. She did not cry. There was no reason to cry. It was simply a horse and a hand, and the particular, unbearable relief of being trusted by something that had learned not to trust. Pell returned from dinner and stopped dead in the stable doorway. He looked at the horse. He looked at the woman. He looked at the horse again. He said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then he went to find Lord Grieve. Ashton arrived at the stable to find Wren brushing the horse's shoulder with a wide, flat brush she had taken from the rack. Revel stood with his head low, his ears at a relaxed half-angle, displaying a quality of patience that Ashton had genuinely not believed him capable of. She did not hear him approach. When she did become aware of him, she turned, but she did not startle. She simply turned, the way a person turns when they have spent enough years learning to keep their reactions below the surface. She dipped her head. "My lord." He looked at the horse. He looked at her. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice came out quieter than he intended. She told him. He already knew. But there was a difference between knowing a person's name and asking for it. And he had been taught, in one of the few useful lessons of his education, that the difference mattered. He said, very carefully, "Miss Calloway." "Is this the first time he has allowed this?" "Since I came on Monday," she said. "Before that, I had only stood in the doorway." He was quiet for a moment. He was watching the horse, but he was also watching her, with the lateral attention of someone who has learned to see more than they let on. He saw the steadiness. He saw, beneath it, something else, a quality he recognized from long practice of looking at things under pressure. It was the steadiness of someone who has learned it the hard way, which is a different thing and entirely from the steadiness of someone who simply was not afraid. She was afraid of many things, he suspected. She simply did not let it show because she had learned at some point that letting it show was not safe. That evening, at his desk, he opened his correspondence with the uncharacteristic urgency of a man who has remembered something important. He wrote to a colleague in Edinburgh who had an interest in legal history. He wrote to a second contact who worked in the court records office. He framed both inquiries as matters of genealogical research. He received replies within the fortnight. He read them by the fire in his study. He read them twice. Arthur Calloway had not committed fraud. This was not a revelation. Ashton had suspected as much from the original coverage, which had the distinctive quality of a case constructed rather than discovered. What the records showed, with the patient clarity of documents that had been waiting for someone to look at them properly, was that the accusation had originated with a rival named Galt, a man who had wanted the legal contract Calloway held with a prominent Edinburgh banking house. Galt had fabricated correspondence. He had suborned 2 witnesses, and when the case had gone to tribunal, 3 pieces of exculpatory evidence that Arthur Calloway's own solicitor had submitted had been quietly removed from the record. Calloway had known he was innocent. He had been unable to prove it, and the system that should have protected him had instead been the instrument of his destruction. Died, as Ashton now understood fully for the first time, a man who had been robbed of everything. His name, his livelihood, and his future, by a mechanism so precisely designed that it left no fingerprints. And his daughter had spent 8 years working her way quietly down the social register until she was sweeping mud in someone else's kitchen garden. Ashton set the papers down. He stared into the fire for a long time. His own family had not been without its failures of integrity. His grandfather had been complicit in the displacement of 3 tenant families during the clearances. His father had won a parliamentary seat through means that did not bear detailed examination. These were things Ashton had known for years and had carried with a private, unspecific shame, the way one carries inherited furniture, not chosen but present, taking up space. He could not undo those things, But he was beginning to understand that there were other kinds of debts, and that sitting with them quietly was not the same as being absolved of them. He was also beginning to understand, with the particular discomfort of a man who prided himself on clarity, that his interest in Miss Calloway was not entirely professional. She began riding Revel 3 weeks after her reassignment, happened incrementally, the way real things happen, not in a single decisive moment, but in small accumulations. First she stood with him, then she brushed him, then Pell, observing with his arms crossed and his face carefully non-committal, watched her lay her hand on the horse's back, and watched the horse stand for it, and cleared his throat in a way that meant he was not going to acknowledge what he had just seen, but was going to remember it. And then one morning, early, when the stable was quiet and the frost was still on the ground, she put a saddle on him, not with drama, not with ceremony. She simply did it, the way she did everything. Quietly, precisely, without excess. He stood for it. She put her foot in the stirrup and waited, giving him time to object. He did not object. She mounted. He walked. He walked as if this were something he had been waiting to do with the right person. She rode him across the stable yard and out onto the frost-hardened lane and back. And, when she returned, Pell was standing in the doorway, looking at her with an expression she had not seen directed at her in many years. It was respect, yet not the obligatory kind that acknowledged her presence and moved on, the genuine kind that rearranged a person's assessment. Ashton was there. He had come down early again. He had been doing this more often. He watched her ride back in, spee. He watched her dismount with the easy economy of someone who had grown up with horses and had simply been a long time without them. He watched her run her hand down the horse's neck. He walked over. She looked up, and this time he saw something different in her expression, not the blank, careful composure of the kitchen yard. Something alive. Something that had been, until this moment, behind a door she kept shut. "You were raised with horses," he said. "My father kept two," she said, when I was young." He heard what she did not say. He had become good in recent weeks at hearing what she did not say. It was a vast and telling vocabulary. He said, "Your father was Arthur Calloway." Calmer. It was not a question. She heard that it was not a question, and the thing that happened in her face in the next moment was not something she could have prevented. It was too old and too deep to be managed in time. She said, "Yes," he said. "I have been looking into his case." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 8 years of cold rooms and careful posture, and a name that was not a shame but had been used as one. Vaughan. She looked at him with eyes that were searching for the thing behind the words. Because she had learned in 8 years that people did not look into things without wanting something. That he had a price, and that help, when it came attached. She said, "Why?" It was the right question. He had expected it. To say. He had thought about how to answer it for several days, which was longer than he usually spent thinking about how to answer anything. "Because the record is wrong," he said, "and because wrong records have consequences, and yours are still living theirs out." He paused. "And because I cannot, in good conscience, know what I now know and do nothing with it." If she was very still, he continued, "there is enough in the existing court documentation to file a petition for formal review. Not a guarantee. A genuine case. The fabricated correspondence can be identified as such. One of the witnesses against your father is still living, and there are records that contradict his testimony. Time it would require the cooperation of a reputable Edinburgh solicitor." He met her eyes. "I know too." She said nothing. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was, he suspected, for something they had in common. Then she said, very quietly, "He died believing it would never be put right," he said. "I know." She looked away, out through the stable door at the frost and the pewter sky. The horse stood at her shoulder, patient and solid. Then she said, "What do you want in return?" He said, "To nothing." She looked back at him. He said, "I am not offering you a transaction. I am correcting a record. It is a different thing." She held his gaze for a long moment. She was measuring him the way she measured everything. Not quickly, not carelessly. Then she gave a single, slow nod. Petition was filed in February. It was not a fast process. Legal processes never were. Petition. And this one was complicated by the age of the documents and the need to locate witnesses who had spent several decades in the comfortable assumption that the Calloway case was finished. Ashton worked methodically. He was better at this than at most things, at the long, cold business of following evidence to its conclusion, of refusing to let a thing go simply because it was inconvenient. During those months, he and Wren developed a pattern. She rode Revel 3 mornings a week. He often appeared on the lane that ran beside the north field, ostensibly for his own morning ride. They would fall in beside each other without arrangement, and ride in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had discovered that they did not need to fill silence, because they were both, at a fundamental level, more comfortable in it than out of it. They talked about the land, about the horse, about the weather, in the way that people talk about the weather when they are actually talking about everything else. He told her about the estate's finances, which were complicated, to say, in the tone of a man who had stopped performing optimism. She told him about the rotation schedule for the kitchen garden, which was more interesting than it sounded, in the tone of a woman who had long since given up, pretending that any task was beneath her. He began calling her Wren. He did not announce the shift. It simply happened one February morning, the word appearing in a sentence without ceremony, and she had not corrected it. She did not call him Ashton for several more weeks. When she finally did, they were standing on the high ground above the east field, looking out over the border hills in the late afternoon light, and the word came out of her the way the hum always came out of her, without deliberate decision, from somewhere below the careful surface. He did not look at her when she said it, but she saw something move in his face, a loosening of the careful lines, the way a room changes when someone opens a window in it. His mother arrived in March. Lady Grieve was a woman who had spent 60 years forming accurate assessments of people within the first 10 minutes of meeting them, and had seen no evidence that this skill was misapplied. She arrived at Cairn Hollow with 2 trunks, a small terrier, and the air of a woman who intended to understand exactly what was happening in her son's house. She found it within 4 days. She watched Wren ride Revel across the north field from the upstairs window. She watched her son watch her. She asked the housekeeper 3 careful questions and received enough from the answers to fill the gaps herself. She summoned Wren to the sitting room on the 5th morning, on the pretext of needing someone to reach a book from the upper shelves. When Wren came in, Lady Grieve looked at her for a long and hurried moment. She said, "Sit down, Miss Calloway." Wren sat. Lady Grieve said, "My son has not slept past 5 in the morning since his father died. He told me last week that he has been sleeping until 6. She paused. "I do not believe this is coincidental." Wren said nothing. Lady Grieve said, "I am not going to warn you off. I want to be clear about that because I suspect you are expecting me to, and I find anticipated warnings tedious. What I want to say is this. My son is not an easy man. He is decent, and he is loyal, and he will not fail you if you give him reason not to. But he is not easy." She looked at Wren steadily. "Neither, I suspect, are you?" Wren said. "No." Lady Grieve said, "Good, easy people are very dull." And she rose and picked up the terrier and said, "That will be all." Wren returned to the stable with the particular feeling of a person who has been assessed and, for the first time in a long time, found adequate. The petition was granted in April. It was not dramatic. Legal vindications rarely were. A document arrived, carefully worded, acknowledging that the original tribunal had proceeded on the basis of evidence subsequently demonstrated to be fabricated, and that the finding against Arthur Calloway was accordingly set aside. His name, the document stated, was formally cleared. Ashton brought it to her in the stable. She read it once, standing in the doorway in the thin April light, the horse at her back. He watched her read it. He watched her come to the end of it, and he watched what happened in her face, which was not what he expected. It was not relief, exactly. It was something older and quieter than relief. It was the face of someone who has been told that the thing they believed in and were not allowed to believe in was true all along. Her father had known he was innocent. He had died knowing it, and now the world knew it too, even if he was not alive to see it. She folded the document along its crease. She pressed it flat with both hands. Then she looked up at him. She said, He would have been glad of you. He felt the weight of that. He did not look away. He said, "Name Calloway stands as it should have always stood. Whatever comes next, that is fixed." She nodded. Then, after a moment, "What does come next?" He looked at her. The horse exhaled behind her, a long, warm breath into the cold spring air. The hills were beginning to green at the margins, he said. "That depends on you. It always has." She held his gaze. There was a steadiness in her, now that was different from the steadiness of the early winter. Not the steadiness of a person working hard to contain themselves, but the steadiness of a person who has stopped having to, she said. "I am not the same woman I was in November." He said, "No, and I am not the same man." He paused. "I think we should walk, and you should tell me what you want, and I will tell you what I want, and we will see if the two things are compatible." The corner of her mouth moved. She said, "That is the least romantic proposal I have ever heard." He said, "It is not a proposal, it is a preliminary conversation." She said, "And what comes after the preliminary conversation?" He said very quietly, "Everything if you'll have it." They walked. The hills were wide and green-edged and cold, and the wind off the high ground was the clean, carrying kind that makes it easier to say true things. They talked for a long time, not about the past, which had been accounted for, but about the future, which had not yet been written, and which felt, for the first time in 8 years, like something she was allowed to think about. His mother sat at the upstairs window and watched them come back along the lane, side by side, unhurried, a horse following at the fence line like an escort. She said nothing. She simply poured herself a second cup of tea. The summer was long and even. The border hills turned gold and rust, and then green again in the autumn rains. Wren did not stop riding Revel, but she was no longer just a woman who happened to know a horse. She was the mistress of Cairnhollow House, which she became quietly and without fuss. The same way she became everything, by simply inhabiting it, fully and without apology. Nor. She kept the kitchen garden rotation that she had designed in her first weeks on the estate. She introduced herself to the tenant farmers by name and remembered their children. She made one change to the main house without consulting anyone, which was to replace the long formal dining table with a round one that seated 10 comfortably and did not require anyone to shout to be heard. Ashton noticed. He said nothing. He thought it was the best decision anyone had made in the house in 20 years. Calloway's name was affixed, by Ashton's request, to a new lending library established in the village. The copper plate read, "In memory of Arthur Calloway, solicitor, Edinburgh, a man of integrity." It was a small thing. It was also the only thing Wren had ever asked for, that she was not sure she had the right to ask for. Ashton had arranged it without being asked. She found out about it one October morning on the way back from riding. She stopped the horse in the lane and looked at the plate for a long time. He was waiting at the stable gate. He saw her expression when she came back. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You did not tell me," he said. "I wanted you to find it the way he would have found it." As a fact already fixed, she looked at him. Something had settled in her in the years since November, not hardened, but deepened, like a river that has found its proper channel. She said, "He would have loved you, you know. He loved people who did things for the right reason and did not make speeches about it." He said, "Then I hope I would have deserved it." She took his hand. Above them, on the cold high air, a red kite turned slow circles over the hillside, riding the updraft without effort, the way wild things ride the wind, not fighting it, not surrendering to it, simply knowing it well enough to let it carry them.